Hello, you're listening to The Future Is A Mixtape. I'm Jesse.
I'm Matt.
This week, we talk about fully automated luxury communism.
In Peter Frase's new book, a recent book, For Futures, Life After Capitalism.
But we do this without Peter because we didn't have enough woofy to afford him.
We need 3D printers to make it happen if we can't get woofy.
We need some of your woofy.
We need your likes. We need your Facebook likes.
And one day we'll get him on the
And we'll
program.
talk about these four futures, which include, things like exterminism, where Matt Damon's the only abundance of things is Matt Damon's muscles in the movie Elysium, and look at RoboCop and other books and texts that he mixes in with this conversation about the future.
Other terminal dystopia tales. Rentism, socialism, and communism. Mm-hmm. Which one do we want? Yeah, so that was a little rough, the circle.
Yeah, I mean, we were saying it was 500 pages, and we didn't know what to do with it because it just didn't have that many ideas in it. Whereas, the book we'll be talking today, Peter Frase's For Futures, is fecund, to borrow the Murray Bookchin fecund meme page from Facebook. So it's got a lot more ideas. It's much more rambunctious, and it says way more in, 149 pages.
Yeah.
Than the 500-page book by Dave Eggers. And what an interesting contrast, because I had to pause here in a way that you typically pause for literary fiction,
right,
which is that there's some depth or moment of reflection that's required before you can read it. But I found myself that I was reading Dave Eggers' book like it was nonfiction, and this felt like fiction because I had to stop and think about the depth of the moment in the sentence itself. And that was a remarkable kind of turn of fate that I'm reading a nonfiction book on political theory and science fiction, and I have to actually pause because there's something deep here.
The book we talked about last week, The Circle, not really one that we can recommend highly, but this one, absolutely. It's just a super dense multivitamin of ideas, and it's something you read in a couple hours.
And we jokingly said that there was more ideas about the future than the 200 pages of the main character, May, doing customer service reports on her multiple laptop screens.
Yeah.
So that has probably 200 pages of dialogue or writing.
Yeah.
And just within this framework, this 149 pages, as we say, 150 pages to be correct.
Flipping through the book right there.
And it's breezy, it's dense, it moves back and forth between concepts and terms. It has, a kind of a fun, risque blog aspect, but it also has some real depth. And it's, I would say it's he almost operates like Quentin Tarantino, like a DJ artist. He really mixes the sources really well, and he has them rub up against each other, and it vitalizes some of these terms that have been put to sleep.
Yeah, it's sort of like a little mixtape.
Yeah, it's
of ideas.
It is like a mixtape. It really is.
Mixtape of ideas.
The hybridization of science fiction text that he uses as a reference point, and then these broadly more conceptual Marxist phrasings.
Yeah. So this is For Futures, Life After Capitalism by Peter Frase, published on behalf of Jacobin Magazine by Verso Books. Verso Books.
It's part of a series, basically.
Yeah, of compact books about social ideas.
Yeah, and so the books offer critical analysis and engagement with the history of ideas of the left in an accessible format. I think this is part of the series with ABC Socialism. The guide that they put together, I think, was the first book, which is just kind of primers to socialism, especially since the founder of Jacobin himself came from, Occupy Wall Street and did a lot of work on that movement and is trying to broadly create culture for the left.
Yeah, and I think this text provides a lot of useful ammunition, useful, like you said, points for reflection. Although you can read through it pretty quickly, it is very approachable and readable. Mm-hmm. It was like every page had something that I marked that was like a great idea to come back to. So
and unlike the kind of the tawdry stereotype about Marxist writing, Marxist thinking, it has a kind of elegance and coherency as well as accessibility that you often find with anarchist writers, which is really refreshing. I think it actually, the editors that are involved with this, Verso and Jacobin, really did make sure to make sure this was accessible and that you could read it straight through without...
What you're hearing is Matthew keeps flipping through the book there.
Yeah. Ooh, yeah. So, I mean, we should start talking about
It's like a little deck of cards.
We should. Oh, so I should say, Peter Frase doesn't mention the origin for this book, other than the fact that this was a shorter essay published in Jacobin back before the
in 2011.
Yeah, and this was published in 2016.
It was originally an essay in Jacobin. We'll leave links to this in the show notes, called For Futures, and it was just expanded into this.
And he doesn't mention any interviews or any of the reviews. And there's once again, I think one of the reasons why we're excited to talk about this is there's so few reviews on this. Other than the Los Angeles Review of Books and San Francisco Review, there isn't really that much written on this. We'll link you to a YouTube interview that Jacobin and Verso does on the book that introduces Peter Frase's book to a wider audience, but it didn't get much press. It didn't get much attention. It's on Laura Flanders as well, but it didn't get a lot of press. Well, once again, that's part of the culture where there isn't just really a lot of reviewers writing and discussing books. But what I can tell, and he doesn't mention this, is that this is actually based or inspired by
borrows the title from
a book called For Futures, 4 Original Novellas of Science Fiction. And this was a book that came out in 1971, and it's basically Asimov who was scrawling kind of paragraph ideas about overpopulation. And the Population Bomb, the book The Population Bomb, which came out in 1968, inspired this science fiction book, which is imagining what happened from overpopulation. And the authors were Harry Harrison, R.A. Lafferty, Alexei Ponshin, and Robert Silverberg, the kind of famous luminary of science fiction.
Have you read that anthology?
No. It's just when I was doing research, it's like, is this phrase coming from somewhere? And it popped up, and it really does seem like it's borrowing from that rubric, because all of these 4 science fiction authors speculate about overpopulation and how it might be dealt with in different future possibles.
Right.
And this is doing this for capitalism.
Right. Extrapolations, to borrow the term from last week's discussion.
Yeah. And so this is once again borrowing the idea of extrapolation and cognitive estrangement. It doesn't have so much cognitive estrangement, but it really is doing extrapolation.
Yeah, this is a very good example of the term we talked about last week in the discussion about the circle of extrapolation as part of the science fiction rubric that he uses.
Based on trends.
Like this is, based on trends. So taking conditions of the current conditions and extrapolating possible futures from those. That's basically the exercise that's going on here.
And so the 4 Futures book with those SF authors is about overpopulation. Here, these 4 futures are 4 futures of a post-capitalist world order.
Right. So there are a few basic sort of assumptions that he sets up in the beginning in order to do this sort of thought experiment. One, we should say that he talks about this in relation to science fiction, and he brings in a lot of science fiction references throughout the text, but posits this project as, it's nonfiction, so it's something different, and it's something different than
science fiction.
Well, and it's not fiction, so it's something different than just social criticism or futurism. It's what he calls social science fiction. We
should wind back and say that he doesn't consider himself a futurist. Now, we can consider that maybe technically a trapdoor he's vainly trying to escape from, but the way in which he talks about futurism, I generally do agree, which is the Ray Kurzweil notion of let's put a date on something and estimate what's going to happen, that kind of the weather forecasting. And he quite rightly, as most SF authors and SF communities would say, authors don't try to predict anything in particular.
Yeah, and he makes it clear in the introduction of the book too. That's not what he's trying to do here. That he
doesn't want to be deterministic.
Yeah. So these are just imaginings of if we extrapolate
from these 4 futures. And he says at several points, especially at the end, that these 4 futures actually already exist in our current moment.
Yeah, and we can see that as we get through the discussion about each of these. We'll sort of go through this systematically and talk about each of these 4 ideas or these 4 potential futures and break them down a little bit.
So the other assumption he's talking about is that capitalism will end.
Right.
It's in a precarious point, and many people would say after 2008 Great Recession that neoliberalism is a kind of a zombie state. It's trying to retrace old steps in the way that it was in the past, but it can't get the growth or productivity that it used to have from the current system. So that's one of his assumptions. The other assumption is that anything that isn't automated could be automated in the future. Right? So he's very much a maximalist when it comes to technology. He's very positive about it. He's not a scab for, deep ecology movement where he thinks humans are scum and they should need to be wiped away to make room for deer and elk.
Yeah, that robots can do all the work.
Yeah.
That will eventually, so the assumption is capitalism is taking two trends that we're seeing currently that we've started to talk about here on the podcast, and we have many more books that we'll bring into the discussion as discussion launch points that are about these speculative signs about the future, that capitalism is going to end. It's not an inevitable thing, that it's not a natural part of the world, and is full of contradictions. So there's all kinds of signposts that we've talked about, that we're going to continue to talk about, that signal the end of capitalism.
I thought that was brilliant, the way he opens up with these two specters haunting the earth. And of course, the specters has a Marxist kind of connotation. Ecological catastrophe and automation. Too little of something, so the notion of scarcity,
right,
posited through ecology,
ecological
and then too much of something, posited through automation.
Right.
That this is a dichotomy, it's dialectical, it's contradictory, and this tension is the confusion that we all feel right now in this moment, where we're like, okay, I can look out my window and see the apocalypse in some ways, right? Like a 10-day heat wave in Southern California in June.
Yeah.
And then at the same time, these YouTube videos for 3D printers that's making like casserole or tablecloths or silverware.
Yep. So he forms this to arrive at these four potential futures, these two axes. One is abundance versus scarcity. The other axis is equality versus hierarchy. And the framework here is that there's these twin anxieties, as you said, about ecological catastrophe, that we're going to experience this extreme scarcity. On the other hand, automation is going to lead us to a world where it's a post-scarcity world and there's no more need for human labor. So the thing that's different here, and that I really appreciate, and this is sort of emblematic of a lot of the work that comes from this group of contributors and editors for Jacobin, and a lot of the authors that Verso works with, is to examine these things through a lens of politics and class struggle. So that's specifically what he's trying to do here, is to inject into the discourse about these, because often there's lots of texts, and he references a lot of things that are about one of these things, like the assumption of automation potentially taking away everybody's jobs, but there isn't always the necessary frameworks of politics and class struggle to frame the reality of these conversations.
That's why he frames this book as a new type of genre of writing, which is the social science fiction genre, because he's using science fiction and lacing it in with social and political theory. So it has this kind of extrapolative science fiction component where it's taking current trends and imagining future landscapes. But at the same time, he does inject politics and class struggle into this, where the kind of techno-optimists that often look at these things. So like Eric, he references a big book, Eric Brynjolfsson and Andrew McAfee. They have a book called The Second Machine Age, Work, Progress, and Prosperity in a Time of Brilliant Technologies. And it tends to focus so much on the technology, it ignores the sociological consequences.
Which are probably more important.
More important, absolutely, because we already have technology expanding and innovating on itself. That's already a given. But he's saying that what's been stripped out of that, and as well as he said that's a problem within science fiction too, is the hard science fiction drive in, especially right now, is to make everything a goddamn equation. There was a trend in the 70s, especially with Ursula K. Le Guin and others, and I think continue with Kim Stanley Robinson, who we'll reference later, where there was a politics and social engagement.
Right.
The soft aspects of society, soft science fiction aspects, are crucial to understanding these scientifically derived innovations.
Right. So these two axes allow him to come up with these two possible directions. One is two futures that are a version of a socialism, or that are socialisms, and two other contrasting futures that are flavors of barbarism. And he defines these futures as ideal types. So what is the phrase that he uses about generalizing so as to get to the underlying causes?
Essentializing?
Yeah. Anyways.
Yeah. But
it's a means to talk about
schematic.
Yeah.
The schematic notions of this. So he wants it to be crude on purpose because he wants to cover a lot of material very quickly.
Yeah,
and doesn't want to insert some manifold expectation of what things are going to be.
These aren't predictions. These are taking the frameworks.
It's a humble approach because he's saying, I don't have 100% idea about all of these things.
Right.
I'm just kind of almost in a blog-like way, a very intelligent blog-like way, opening this up for call and response with the reader.
Yeah, yeah. So these 4 simplified societies are 1, communism, which is equality and abundance.
Comes with baggage as a term, of course.
All of these, they come with baggage as terms, and we'll talk about that. Rentism, which is hierarchy and abundance. Socialism, which is equality and scarcity. And exterminism, which is hierarchy and scarcity. Mm-hmm. And that's the order in which he talks about them. But the 2 socialisms, obviously, are communism and socialism. And the opposing direction of 2 futures are rentism and exterminism.
I thought that was a little confusing the way it's subtitled. So he says communism. So when we talk about these axis points between equality and hierarchy versus abundance and scarcity, he starts with communism, rentism, socialism, and exterminism. But he should be saying abundance and equality versus abundance versus hierarchy. So he needs to pair them up.
You would have flipped them around.
Flip them around because for me, ecology is everything, right? Like ecology is everything. And so he's privileging class relations too much in that component. And once again, I think it's because it's a humanist discourse.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, once again, it's the assumption that, especially with communism, that abundance is evidently clear, in which I once again question in terms of abundance. If you're just thinking of terraforming other planets or mining on rocks, you could say that we could have hyperabundance, but I think already there's limits to abundance as a notion if we're just looking only at the Earth. So to me, him looking at abundance and scarcity, it would put a more ecological focus on this, and it pairs up the chapters better than flipping back and forth. So I sometimes got confused, and I mostly focused on the terminology he was using. And so that was a little bit weird, but I also thought was weird is that he starts with the most optimistic and then goes to the most negative.
Well, and flip-flops. There goes communism to rentism, then socialism to exterminism, which you could do it from in the rank order of which is the most positive future for the greatest number of people in order would be from worst to best would be exterminism, rentism, socialism, and then communism.
Yeah, I think that would have been. I think that would have been a much better
to go from the shitter to the.
Well, I think that's the
utopia.
That's probably my biggest beef with the book. Is it's
it would have gone from dystopia to.
It's trying to encourage us to take active engagement in utopian politics, but its weakest chapter is actually the one that's supposed to be the most utopian because he just really disengages with the idea of actually mapping out anything specifically.
Yeah, that's a little.
It's debate for us.
Yeah, it's debate for us, which is good.
But he's not Karl Marx. I mean, it's not like I think at the point we could ask for people to design this, but he could reference people that are landscaping this. I mean,
right.
And I think that's the thing where the communism sections works really well is when he actually ends up talking about Cory Doctorow's Down and Out in the Magic Kingdom, which is I would say utopian, not perfect society, but obviously utopian post-scarcity society.
Yeah, and we'll come back to that in a second. But I think that there's something to debate here, and there's some ideas that we're going to have some real energetic debate about. Is a sign that this is a rich book of ideas, and it's a positive reflection on the work and the quality of the work here.
I'm confident you could give this to any fairly literate person, and they would be able to read and understand.
This should be read in high school.
Oh yeah, I think. Absolutely.
But also,
it doesn't. It never feels dumb in terms of its basic word usage. It's spareness.
No. That's the genius of it. If I may go so far as to say that is that this brevity of it.
It's not a inscrutable T.S. Eliot poem, right? It's really like an Elizabeth Bishop poem.
Yeah, it's
almost a Blakean simplicity reveals complexity underneath, which is why you pause because you're like, well, this is a really easy sentence.
What was that I just read?
Well, it's like this is a very simple phrase, but I have to stop and think about it.
Yeah. So it's very economical in the writing.
It reminded me in a lot of
well.
ways of David Graeber's own writing, right? Which is
Exactly.
incredibly accessible,
I agree with that,
but raging through deep conceptual thinking. And so you're like, whoa, this is really
right to the gut.
Yeah, because it sounds very conversational and breezy, and then bam, there's a real paradigm shifting observation in that sentence.
Yeah.
So I think that my major grumps is that the appeal to the future, the appeal to utopian politics is very much at the conclusion, but the way it's arranged kind of inhibits the utopian impulse.
Hey, so here's an idea. Why don't we go through them in that order? Let's go from worst to best. You want to do that?
Oh, the worst future to the best future?
Yeah,
I think it's a great idea.
Yeah. Why don't we do that? We'll remix.
This is how we want it.
Yeah,
we'll remix his remix. Yeah. So exterminism.
We'll start with the worst one, which is the last.
The worst future, not the worst part of the book.
No.
The worst future.
Yeah, and I have to say before we launch into that I couldn't help but think, well, given our previous reading of and discussion of the two versions, the film version and the novel The Circle, and our criticisms there about this terminal dystopia syndrome and the lack of cultural imaginings of utopian stories, that I can imagine that we'll see in 5 or 10 years, if the people read this book, and if the certain people read this book, we might see a new filmmaker on the scene that's making some utopian tales that was informed by this text. I think this is the kind of text that would inform. If I was a sci-fi writer, I'd be like, this is interesting.
And I also think it breaks out of the binary, which is Yanis Varoufakis, the gentleman that worked for Greece in terms of as a finance minister. He's said in several interviews, both with Doug Henwood Behind the News and also Russell Brand in a recent podcast, that we either have a Star Trek future, right, of a post-scarcity, socialist, global internationalist, almost classless society.
Right.
When there is hierarchy, it's only because people are traveling outside in dangerous areas and need that hierarchy. Whereas the Earth is blasé and pretty happy.
Yep.
And versus the Matrix, right, where AI is using us as fuel.
Yep.
And so this goes against that kind of binary notion, not only of the utopian aspects of hyperabundance through 3D printing and technology versus the dystopian aspects of an ecologically collapsed Earth. It says, look, there's actually 4 possible futures.
Right. And these aren't prescriptive, like you said.
And they'll blend. And I think that's really important.
We'll see, or you'll see if you read through this and through this discussion, that reflections of our current condition in each of these.
Yes.
So to one degree or another. And I think we'll start here with the
exterminism.
With exterminism, which is the least desirable future for the most people, but is the most reflective of the world that we live in today. And I like how we just opened up to the discussion about it here, which is it's communism for the few, right? It's communism, or an idealized, automated, luxury experience of the world for a tiny ruling class.
And I'll provide a personal story about this. So, Neil Blomkamp's film Elysium on 2013 is a dystopian idea of a earth-bound world of depravity, scarcity, resource deprivation, and the satellite planet, the satellite or International Space Station,
basically,
that's ecotopia, with these med bays that allow you to live forever and get rid of cancer and basically make you immortals. And you have this almost looks like this South Orange County suburbia that's spinning around on this satellite loop, basically outside
the communist paradise.
Communist paradise,
just for the ultra rich.
For the communism for the few, right? I thought this was interesting because personally, in my own life, I was involved with Occupy Riverside, part of the Occupy movement that blew up on all parts of the country.
Right.
And when Occupy had died, I was like, well, we need to find a cultural moment where we can reinvigorate this discussion, because Occupy had been broken up vis-a-vis Obama, governors, the police state.
Yeah.
And so it didn't organically form into a long-lasting movement, not because of its internal contradictions, although the police were involved, but
the lack of articulated demands.
Absolutely, and we'll talk about this for future episodes. But Elysium came out, and I thought this was going to be the first Occupy film. That would be.
I remember you talking to me.
I actually have a Facebook page called Occupy Elysium.
Yeah.
And I actually boosted that shit on Facebook, and I was going to use it as a tool to talk about inequity, massive global
I remember
inequality.
we talked about that a lot before it came out, and then it was like,
because the film was shitty, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it was just such a mess.
I mean, it was all right.
It wasn't
a disaster
horrible,
like The
but
Circle.
It just seemed like he used the social commentary was kind of basically scraped under, and I thought it had a lot to do with the fact that his wife didn't write the screenplay with him. And then
he's a filmmaker that had a lot of promise because District 9, I think, was the firm.
A huge film, and it's smart and savvy, and maybe people want to problematize the notion of racism and using apartheid as part of that logic, but it had real savvy aspects of blending idea of The Office with biopunk novels or biopunk films, as well as the alien encounters, and turning that into an allegory that's inverted, where aliens are the subjugated species and humans are the settled or colonial species. So for me, what ends up being a problem with Elysium, why I don't think it's the best example of exterminism, is because, number one, we don't see the scarcity that much in the film. We see the desperate conditions where it's basically everything looks like Mexico. I mean, that's kind of, and they're making weapons.
Or it looks like our idea of Mexico.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's kind of how it's filmed. I mean, it was actually, I think, shot in parts of Baja California. But the problem with it is we don't see the contrast of the scarcity with the med bay reality of the satellite world. But I think the film that came out later, Snowpiercer by Bong Joon-ho, is actually the really good example of exterminism as a science fiction text. And it really allocates idea of where there's communism for the few at the front of the train,
right,
and the engine itself, which is just being really only functioning through human labor.
And I think what you're pointing towards there that I recognize is that in Snowpiercer, it's much more meaningful in the arc of the narrative.
Yes.
The struggle between the class struggle is much more
you
clear.
You get an object feeling as passing through those class strata.
Exactly.
Where, you're in the back of the train, you're on the bottom recess, homeless / indentured servitude, slavery, eating weird gel shit that's made from insects, and then crossing through the middle class horizon, through the discotheque, and up to the front of the train, where there's a beautiful breakfast and the guy in the robe. I mean, and moving through that Paradise Alley, you see the resources being used or misused through that train and the great inequity of it. And also the fact that there's, everything's frozen over outside of the train.
Right.
So I think that's a better SF text.
Yeah, so that may be a good thing to reference in thinking about this idea of exterminism and communism for the few. But also Elysium's a good theoretical, it's a good, as the premise anyways, is a good example of this.
Yeah,
it's a good illustration of the concept.
I'm glad, he didn't use Mad Max, right? Because
that's not
Mad
really
Max, there's not even really a communism anywhere.
Where are
the people that have
ruling class?
It's basically, the trailer trash are the people that are living the best.
Yeah.
So it's a completely apocalyptic narrative. Here, it's apocalyptic in terms of its relationship between this tyranny of the minority that has all of the resources. And this is kind of the argument of exterminism, is it's not that scarcity itself is affecting the wealthy and the privileged ruling class. It's that the hardships and extreme suffering is really being felt through scarcity on working class people and people of color and people outside that.
And he introduces some ideas through here in the sequencing here. Since we're going a little bit, we're breaking it up here. There are concepts and ideas that he mentions earlier in previous chapters that inform the subsequent ones. So in the chapter on socialism, he draws out this relationship or the condition of ecological scarcity as it's made manifest in exterminism, which is that the real question about climate catastrophe isn't whether or not civilization or human civilization can survive this ecological crisis, but it's whether all of us can survive it. So exterminism would be a condition in which the tiny minority survive, and so there's the scarce amount of resources for the rest of us, and
the further degradation of these people on the margins. So he talks about like kind of a pattern process where first, when we talk about exterminism, doesn't start immediately with the murdering of the othered marginal components of the society. It's through would you say, indifference, then disgust, then seclusion, then enclosure, incarceration, then executions, and then the executions just turn into genocide.
Yeah, and he talks about, he uses the example of horses. And
that's incredible.
So in terms of automation, right? So the automation is in the hands of the tiny few. And
let's look at that clip about the horses. I mean, this little passage in 127, he says...
Page 127?
As he then notes, this led
this is a quote from...
Oh, yeah, this is a quote from Wassily Leontief, the Nobel Prize-winning economist. And he says in here, he provides a somewhat shocking but essentially appropriate analogy. He compares workers to horses. One might say that the process by which progressive introduction of the new computerized, automated, and roboticized equipment can be expected to reduce the role of labor is similar to the process by which the introduction of tractors and other machinery first reduced, then completely eliminated horses and other draft animals in agriculture. As he then notes, this led most people to the conclusion that, from the human point of view, keeping all these idle horses would make little sense. As a result, the horse population fell from 21.5 million in 1900 to 3 million in 1960. So that's remarkable.
This is a future where humans would face that same sort of prospect, that now that robots do all the jobs and there's not need for humans to exploit for labor, humans become a problem and a threat to the ruling minority, and then be subject to
forms of rationalization,
right?
Rationalization towards exterminism. He actually makes some really controversial and interesting, compelling claims about Israel, right? So he talks about how the exclusion of Palestinians come as a result of this other marginal population that can be replaced. So Ethiopians or people from different regions of northern Africa come in and provide the cheap labor that Palestinians used to provide.
Right.
So they're just not needed because their labor can no longer be allocated over because they found a substitute. And so he says this process of ghettoization of this marginal class means that if you reduce their population, they're less of a long-term threat, right? To this ruling class within the culture of exterminism or the future of exterminism.
Right. And we should all recognize this. Obviously, some populations, some parts of the world, some groups feel this more directly than others, but all of us who are not owners of capital, it should be clear to us in our day-to-day lives that we are not necessary except for, we're not necessary to capitalism except for the labor we provide. That's what we get up and each of us get up and do every day, is sell ourselves so that others, a select few, can profit off of our labor.
And he cites other examples of contemporary notions of exterminism through Christian Parenti's book, Tropic of Chaos, Climate Change and the New Geography of Violence, published in 2011, which documents how the climate crisis in the global south, or third world, if you choose to use those terms, facilitates this scarcity, is also this exterminist culture, where paramilitary aspects or black water or other elements cohere to the state to try to exterminate populations that threaten their resource control.
Right, and this is what we can see today, even the beginnings of automation working to enable the tiny ruling minority to control the rest of the population. And I really like how he talks about the militarization of the police and the military-industrial complex, as we have to see it there, not just about fighting foreign enemies, but it's the purpose of this hyper-militarization, the expansion of the military-industrial complex in these times, in 2017, is to protect owners of capital. We see that every day. We saw it yesterday. We're recording this the day after the...
You're talking about London?
Well, in London. We saw it in St. Paul, Minnesota, yesterday after the acquittal of the police officer who shot Philando Castile. It was streamed live on Facebook.
It's almost as if serial killers are going to start buying police uniforms because they can get immunity that way.
We saw it in Portland recently when the militarized police cooperated with private militias.
Well, and I think that the notion is that this exterminism culture we see through the incarceration rates, right? Like, of mostly nonviolent crime, and where, in the U.S., we're 4% of the globe's population, but 25% of its prison population.
Yeah.
So when social justice activists, as well as people that work on justice rights for folks that are embodied by color, they will often say, hey, this is just a return to the slave ship, right?
Yeah.
That if the design of the prison looks like a slave ship, and it's functioning very much like a slave ship.
Yeah. And we see in the Obama administration's use of this thing that he references, the disposition matrix and the targeted
Kill list. It's an
kill
algorithm.
List. Yeah.
So we're giving ourselves up to an algorithm.
Yeah. So with automation, this also can be labor that's automated away.
And it creates
policing.
a rationalization culture, right?
Yeah.
Like you can deflect your moral obligation to what you just did because the algorithm did it.
And we see this this is why your criticisms aside about the film Elysium, this is why it's a good reference point for, as an example of this, is the roboticized police and military force in Elysium is there to control the population, right?
Well, and the hyper-militarization, like that, the fact that the weapons that are being made on Earth away from this med bay communist satellite space station, all the weapons are being built by the people that are going to be subjugated by them.
Yeah. That's what they're there. That's what they're for. That's why they're left alive, is so that they can
produce their own oppression.
Exactly.
Like, not just inverted in terms of psychology about accepting their positions as second-class humans, but also the notion that they're producing the very weapons that are going to be used against them for later exterminist cultures.
So I think what's also most telling here is that not only is this probably the most reflective overall of our current conditions, but it's also the one we have the most stories about. It's the one that he has the most reference points for in the culture. So we talked about Elysium, he talks about Minority Report, talks about RoboCop, and
Pre-crime.
we can just the list goes on because there's just so many of these dystopian tales. It's
surveillance, control, extermination.
Because this is such a clear direction that we feel and have felt for the past half century that we're heading towards, that we're stuck in this terminal dystopia syndrome, and these are all the stories we know how to talk about.
It seems to be acknowledged by people that are profiting from utopian philanthrocapitalism, like Bill Gates, Bill Gates talks about saving the world with his multi-billion-dollar estate to stop starvation. He's got a bunker underneath his house, according to some sources, that's built by a company called Trident Lake, and they're building these massive compounds underneath.
Yeah, we see this. The billionaires, the tiny ruling class, are putting themselves in these utopian communist enclaves
because they even doubt what they're preaching.
Protect themselves in this bubble from the rest of the world. Richard Branson's lived on this island for decades that he bought, Necker Island. That's now a resort for something like 50,000 pounds a week. You can go and have the island to yourself. This is an idea that you see in this TV show, the Showtime show called Billions. They have the main character, one of the main characters, a billionaire, has this bunker that he buys. Like, this is what's...
Well, this is the irony.
This is like happening
the irony
for
is
real.
that Goldman Sachs and others are going to Africa, not for resource exploitation, but actually just to basically hedge their bets when collapse does occur. So these are the same companies that lobby against saving the ecology and creating a culture of abundance. They're buying the resources not for future profit, but just to kind of hedge their bets if things collapse.
Yeah, well, and I like how Peter Frase points out in the book here that all this climate science deniers don't necessarily believe the bullshit that they're trading in. They don't believe this bullshit that it's not real. Like, they know that some of them, may be oblivious to this, but
well, the money they make from the money they make from their denial pads their profits, which then creates their bunkers.
Like, it is a strategic move to push this denial stuff because they know it's happening, but they just want to make sure that they're the ones who survive the climate collapse. And it's like, if the rest of the world is burning down, as long as they behind their
and these are people that preach
hedges.
Global democracy through capitalism, but yet they distrust the democratic order to save itself.
Yeah, that's where we can't. We can't.
This contradiction is tragic and frustrating, horrific. That they're using money through politics to deny climate change, And then the profits that come from that denial then go towards their individual
And we
protection.
know this. We see this. Normal people see this, feel this every day. That's why we're no longer buying this bullshit that centrists, the Clintons.
And what we should call the radical center.
Yeah, the radical center is trying to sell us and convince us is the only way.
The most delusional people right now is not the right or the left. It's the radical center that thinks that status quo is going to stick around.
No. The status quo is going to lead us to this exterminism future.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
At least with rightists, nationalists, and xenophobes and homophobes, alt-right and 4chan culture, at least I know where they're coming from. It's hard to know exactly what the Hillary Clintons and Obamas really think of the world because they just think that they can risk manage their way out of this current system.
They think as long as they are safe.
Yeah,
sure.
Absolutely. They think that we just need more moderation.
We need less democracy.
Yeah, exactly. So just Obama's every 2 weeks he's talking about creating a new Democratic Party. Give me a break. Take your $800,000 and
move us
shove
to
it up your butt.
Center. So that's the pure dystopian
RoboCop world.
RoboCop Minority Report extrapolated world.
I will say one thing, that it's a missed opportunity that isn't mentioned in Paolo Bacigalupi's book, The Wind-Up Girl, which I think is the seminal text for exterminist futures. And I would really recommend reading that because the premise of that book is basically that big agriculture is done by 2 or 3 major players, basically a version of Monsanto and those sorts of things that basically hack, the seeds or organic crops of local regions, and then they force them to buy their genetically modified food.
Well, actually, I think that's probably more an appropriate fit for this next one, Rentism. Actually, that's almost exactly what he...
Well, I think that's
almost exactly what he talks about in Rentism, because we move on to Rentism.
But this is not a world of abundance in The Wind-Up Girl. I mean, there's very few places alive that have cities. So it takes place in Thailand, I think Bangkok, if I remember right. And it has a system of dams to keep it from flooding.
Right.
So it has a very complex dam system, and essentially... there's very few remaining societies. Kind of like Cloud Atlas from David Mitchell's An Orison of Somni 451, where this future 23rd century of a South Korean city like Seoul is basically one of the last remaining civilizations.
So it's a story of hierarchy and scarcity.
It is.
But I think it probably uses, from your description at least, it's perfect, more about rentism.
Because they own the crops and then they hack the free seeds to destroy them so that you're forced to buy from these large big ag companies. So that renting aspect, the idea of proprietarians, definitely does fold into the next one we want to talk about, which is rentism, right?
Yeah, so rentism, hierarchy, and abundance. So this is where, if we extrapolate we have a ecological abundance, the robots can do everything, but the question posed here is who owns the robots? Right? Who owns this new means of production if we're able to eliminate the need for human jobs in the system and it's all automated and there's enough resources to produce whatever we want.
Exactly. Sets up these contradictions because the workers that use and buy the money, the goods, they no longer have the jobs to buy those goods.
Right.
And this is where he says that there's kind of some slippage with the terminology. So the abundance is being felt through that working class somehow, not to the extent of other more utopian cultures, but certainly there's more abundance, or there's an overflow of abundance that isn't just the communism of the few, but you can have some aspects of the communism vis-a-vis payment plans, right?
Right. You can be in debt for your
exactly. So you can have the replicator from Star Trek, but you have to pay for the each product that you make. So you have to pay a tithing.
Yeah, it's a future where utopia is possible, but it's held in check by class structure and state powers. Right?
I thought there was a blind spot with this section because it doesn't talk about real estate. It just talks about new notions.
He talks about owning property and stuff, but not really real estate.
It talks about intellectual property exclusively.
Not entirely exclusively. There's like property, but I think
not more than a paragraph, if anything, about the notion of property. So that the intellectual property has basically scaled up, and he extrapolates like how absurd this could get.
Right. So this is a future where we could envision 3D printing technology and all these things leading us to actually being able to have technology like the replicator from Star Trek, where you just have to have the pattern, the code, and you can make whatever you want instantly. So there's no scarcity. It's a post-scarcity. This is a tool in Star Trek that allows for this post-scarcity world. And so this technology exists in this future, but there's controls on it. You can't just...
So the hierarchy blocks out the shared abundance. It's assumed here that everybody could have abundance, but the hierarchy blocks out that abundance because they want their class privilege. They want that ownership of means of production. They don't trust fundamentally that there would be enough abundance. So it shows a distrust that abundance couldn't be shared widely and still being celebrated. So does he give examples of he calls it the anti-Star Trek future. I guess an example I could use is Philip K. Dick's amazing book, Ubik. Have you heard of this? This is considered one of his greatest novels. But it has aspects of the idea of a half-life where people are in and out of death and you can actually communicate through them while they're in a kind of half-death process. But one of the main characters goes to his house, and every time he has to use one of the actual items of his house, he has to put coins in it. So when he opens up his door, he has to find coins to open his door, and his fridge and his microwave and all the kinds of domestic spaces we don't think of as transactional. Once we buy them, we own them. In the book Ubik by Philip K. Dick, which he should have used for this, the main character has to keep putting coins into everything he's using. He's frustrated because he runs out of coins or he can't find them, and he actually really needs them. And that's a good corollary to his discussion about John Deere tractors. The idea that, that John Deere actually makes the fucking crazy ass legal argument that they're just borrowers of the items that they've bought.
That when you buy a tractor, that you're not actually, it's not actually yours. You just licensed for use of the tractor.
Yeah. And any modifications are illegal.
This is because this is a legal argument because farmers were making modifications to their tractors. Trying to repair their
or save costs, exactly.
or repair their tractors, and there's this whole legal battle, and this was the argument they made.
The amazing notion is it's almost that kind of logic legally makes it sound like the tractor's a living thing, like it's an adopted child that you took from another family. And you can't touch it too much, or you're a pedophile.
Yeah,
and this is kind of the weird logic of these legal claims is that you're just temporarily borrowing it from us,
right?
And we do know, for instance. There's a great organization called Open Source Ecology where they can print a John Deere tractor for 1/10 of the price because they don't have to pay for all these copyrights.
A John Deere tractor?
Yeah.
In Open Source Ecology did this?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So in Open Source Ecology, we'll talk about this later. These are open source
machines.
technology, exactly.
Farm machines.
So this is the idea of hyperabundance and then also open source. The idea of a real communism. They can produce right now through open source technology a John Deere tractor that does pretty much the same thing without the customization. And that's the thing, John Deere customizes the aspects of it so it's hard to replicate.
Right.
So you can't actually mimic it. And so they have an open source 3D tractor that's 1/10 of the price of an actual John Deere tractor and does the same work.
Right. So in this imagined or extrapolated future, the new ruling class are the few folks who own copyrights and patterns to things.
And he says that's the predominant thing. He gives some shocking statistics about, for instance, the European Union as well as the U.S., like how much of the GDP, gross domestic product.
Oh, it's from intellectual property.
It's from exclusively intellectual property.
So we can see this as well as part of our current condition.
Hollywood.
Hollywood. Entire
toys.
Music industry.
It's just reselling it's usury. I mean, it's basically making
copyright on everything. And by the way, this podcast is not copyright. Share it. Do whatever the fuck you want with it.
Yeah, absolutely. Advertising is not in our future.
Once something's in the world, it belongs to the world.
Absolutely. And we see some of this desire to have open source things, even within something as commodified as Facebook, where you can literally download a photo from your friend and it'll be on your laptop. So there is this desire where we kind of squeak out some of these resources for open source use. But this is definitely very much a surveillance controlling society that has enough abundance, or it's ecologically worked around climate change to the degree that there's still abundance, but it's owned. And he doesn't talk about this, but for instance, there's a company called Aeroponics, right? Or I'm sorry, Aerofarm, I think it's called. Aeroponics is a technology where you can mass produce agricultural products in a kind of vertical warehouse that uses 95% less water,
Right.
no organic, no pesticides at all, no Roundup, nothing, and uses a kind of LED light system that grows twice as fast. So it actually it's more efficient than the normal growing cycle. And that's incredible in terms of abundance. But if AeroFarms is something that copyrights all of those technologies, that's a really scary thing, because now you have this kind of ownership of something that should be abundant.
Right.
And this is the concern about Uber, is Uber will say, hey, look how cheap this is. Use our driverless cars, use the photo app. And then what will happen is they are such a monopoly that suddenly it becomes more expensive to use this so supposedly efficient system because of monopoly power than to actually own a car.
Right.
And then you could go to jail for owning a car. So this is the kind of futures that you could look at. And
this is one of the chapters where he talks about really the only solution-based idea, I think, throughout the text, which is universal basic income, the idea of universal basic income. So
would have to be implemented.
He posits, well, what happens here in this system of hierarchy and abundance
and automation
in automation, when the people need to be able to put their coins in the replicator machine in order to pay for their cup of coffee. Where are they going to get the money to do that? And so that's where he says, here's one place where a future where you could have universal basic income, which basically would just act as a
way to block revolutionary forms from happening.
Well, it's just act as an allowance to enable you just to get
a tacit agreement to keep the status quo.
Right.
I mean, this is what rulers figured out with the notion of Jubilee. I mean, Jubilee wasn't just some act of generosity. Abyssinian culture, and David Graeber talks about this in Data 5,000 Year History, is that they would lose their entire privilege as a ruling class if they didn't monitor the exploitation at the bottom. And so debt forgiveness became a way of course, looking like an awesome person, but also keeping the established order intact. And so UBI will actually be essential for this.
Right.
And so this is at least, 3 out of the 4 here involve some level of UBI, I would say, right? Maybe not some level of UBI.
Yeah, exterminism, it's not part of that because it's like, fuck everybody else.
Exactly.
But these other ones, it's like these other 3 possible futures, there's some sort of allowance for the right for other humans besides the owners of capital to exist.
Because there is enough abundance that you don't need to hoard it to the degree that you do in exterminism.
Right, but there's also, in this sort of condition, there would be the need for some jobs, mostly bureaucratic jobs, in order to police the licensing of copyrighted or intellectual property. So the combination of those things would allow for people to exist. So
should we go to
that's another horrible future.
Exactly.
Horrible future.
The second
not
worst.
Quite as
the second worst.
Not quite as bleak as just being killed by robots,
or being an African American male, in the United States, right?
Already today,
every day,
2017
every day.
is a horrible fucking future.
Yeah,
this is a fucking fucked up world we live in.
And so the second best or third worst one is the is socialism, equality, and scarcity.
So this is like communism, and I think we had some how you say, a little bit of concern, not I mean just semantic concern about the use of the terminology here
Socialism
in these last
so broad,
two, socialism and communism and I guess coming from a Marxist perspective, this makes sense if you look at it as a Marxist reading, that socialism being a path towards communism and communism being the ideal state for condition for social arrangements. But
what does that mean? I mean,
socialism is more a broader
deeper,
term that we
high
use.
Anarchy. I mean, there's also stateless socialism, which he doesn't really discuss in either of these 4
And
futures.
I think it's just as a weight. It's just you got to have some term.
Yeah,
here.
and this is where I think his creativity falls apart, because I think the accuracy is really pitch point. Rentism and exterminism is exactly what he's defining, whereas I think socialism and communism is both vague and also heavy with baggage. So
I think I would be concerned more about the
But it became a kind of distraction when I was reading it, because I kind of hung up on the term like this doesn't sound like what I think of communism or what I think of socialism.
But I think it's fine and it's useful. Even still, it's fine and it's useful as a tool
It's a place
of
setter.
language.
It's a place setter
in order to communicate the ideas. So it's perfect. It's fitting in that regard. But I think anyone who would then read a text like this or read this text or from this discussion of it, then be imagining solutions for the future. These may not serve you all too well.
Yeah,
right?
no.
You may want to, anyways.
So this is like communism, but with the constraints of scarcity and ecological devastation. So this assumes that climate change gets out of whack so bad that we see the suffering in such a widespread degree that we engage in socialist acts and tributes. And I mean, this is something that you could see in Rebecca Solnit's Paradise Built in Hell, where scarcity because of an apocalyptic scenario like an earthquake or a bombing or whatever, or terrorist attack, forces people into socialist reciprocal relations because of the scarcity, because they know they've all lost people. That's the scarcity of loss of human life, and also the environmental damage.
Yeah, the solidarity around the struggle in this kind of future.
So the socialism is really rooted out of the suffering.
Right. It's a feeling of compassion that we're all trying to cooperate to manage and distribute in a compassionate and equitable way the limited resources.
And this is what's great about the book, because once again he says, well, look, this scarcity could go to a post-scarcity communist future, that this is an intermediate stage. Well, let's say where climate change forces us into positions of socialism, but long term, we can move to abundance after repairing the earth. And there's a sequence of what he talks about from Kim Stanley Robinson's 3 Californias trilogy. One's a nuclear war, one's a dystopia, one is a kind of ecological utopia that has scarcity issues, where they're recycling concrete. They're asking, like, why did you have stop signs? Why did you guys invent cars? What a bad idea that was.
Right. This would be a path towards communism, right? And partly helped along by a universal basic income again, right? That we
3 of the
would
4 have UBI in it.
Right, and under egalitarian social organizing, we would work together, we would cooperate to address the scarcity problem and address the ecological catastrophe that you could imagine retargeting the energy that's going, energy and labor and resources that are currently being wasted away on military and other useless and destructive forces, and reposition them towards a reconstruction of the ecology.
And this suggests that automation hasn't occurred as quickly as it's supposed to.
Right.
Where ecological, let's say green collar jobs, green jobs become part of what's both meaningful, because much of the work that has to be done is because of these climate catastrophes, right? And where we're forced into the position of socialism because scarcity means we have to share more and more. And you see this with, of course, immigrants in the United States. They are forced by design because of scarcity of money, resources, rent, living spaces to share incredibly. And you see this in the documentary Happy, where you see a rickshaw driver who's a rickshaw driver in India, and you're like, oh God, what a sad little man he is. Like, he doesn't have a mall nearby or McDonald's. And then you see his house, which is just tarp and, pans and a kind of loose bedding. And he says that he loves how the wind moves through the tarp, and that he sees his children and the joy that he sees and the sense of belonging, because they live in such close quarters. He really feels like they need him and he needs them. So you have a real sense of belonging. And then it says at the end of that opening clip from Happy that he's as happy as an average American. And he's a fucking rickshaw driver.
Yeah.
So that the ecological catastrophe forces us finally into the box of socialism.
Right.
Which we've been able to avoid as a consequence of consumption.
We see here the possibility of a very near future if we can mobilize and collectively demand and work towards and offer ideas, better ideas about the future, that this could very well reflect a lot of the things that we may experience in our lifetimes, in our near future.
It's something we're going to see from millennials a lot more.
Right.
Where they just have to share much more than we did.
Right.
So there's a lot more sharing among millennials in general. Resources, phones, cars, driving, spaces. So millennials are so scarce for resources that they're almost in this position.
And that we recognize our responsibility not only to each other, but to the planet and taking care of this monster that we've made of the earth. And I like the reference he makes here to Frankenstein.
Oh, let's talk about that. It's from he cites I can't remember the author's name, but he's a French philosopher. He says that the mistake about the reading of Frankenstein isn't that Frankenstein the doctor, right? The monster is just the monster. It doesn't really have a name. But yes, Frankenstein the doctor, Dr. Frankenstein. Yeah. Is that the mistake wasn't just creating him in the fallacy or the ignorance of creating something without any awareness of why, but actually that Dr. Frankenstein created something amazing, but decided to abandon it. And this becomes a metaphor both from this philosopher as well as the author, that this is a stand-in metaphor or allegory for our relationship with technology and or nature, that we manipulate both of these things. Humans are manipulating the surface of the earth at a breathtaking space in terms of ecological harm, but also that technology itself is manipulating us and manipulating our food and our weight and our thinking, and that we can't abandon it. Right, and that's the lesson of Frankenstein.
Right.
I love that.
It's the French sociologist Bruno Latour who made this observation about Frankenstein, and that the real sin of Frankenstein, Dr. Frankenstein, not the monster, the scientist, was in not making his creation, but in abandoning it to the wilderness rather than loving and caring for it.
Which is great, because that's not the interpretation the author Mary Shelley had. Her interpretations become our interpretation, which is the idea of playing God with science or playing God with technology. Right. And he says, no, actually there's a much better, more meaningful lesson to be made from this. And Mary Shelley, by the way, Mary Shelley's book, Frankenstein, has been far more important as a text than anything her husband wrote. If we actually look at the impact it's had on society as a genre, horror, science fiction, and this is considered one of maybe possibly the first science fiction texts.
And I think it's also a reference point to remind us of the significance culturally and in terms of our discourse, how that science fiction and fiction plays. Because think about how we talk about the world when it becomes to look a little frightening. Like the most common refrain is Orwellian. And we're always referencing 1984. We're always referencing Big Brother. Like Big Brother is a meme that's separated from its source material and exists as an idiom in the culture outside of that. It has its own meaning. So I think it's just a signal how important creative work is. One, right? How important creative work is when we talk about the value of labor and what humans ought to be doing and what communism,
caretaking, emotional labor of taking care of your Frankenstein
would look like, but just how we so desperately need narratives in the culture that are more utopian.
You need to take care of your Frankenstein
because we model the world after them. We see it all the time.
When you're on Pornhub and you're taking care of your Frankenstein, you need to do the emotional labor of caring for it. And that's kind of the message here. I mean, I think the passage that's great is talking about reconstruction efforts because of this ecological scarcity, right? And the scarcity isn't because of just that automation didn't quite follow through, but that the economic and ecological catastrophe of climate change means that we would have to move military, right? Because military is an abandonment of nature and technology.
Right.
And he doesn't explicitly draw that out, but when I was reading, I was like, oh my God, actually, military is Frankenstein because it's an abandonment of technology and nature.
Yes.
And by rerouting that fiscal energy, $600 billion a year, towards ecological reconstruction, you have permanent employment.
So it's easy to imagine a major public works project that we could next year, if we had the right momentum behind us.
If we used $600 billion for a Marshall Plan on climate change, Naomi Klein talks about, and this changes everything, we could pay people all over the world that are from the global south money to rescue those habitats, especially like the Congo, right? The Congo is the most resource-rich place, but the people are the poorest in the world because of the fight for those resources.
Right.
And we could actually take that $600 billion right now and use it and spread it around the globe, and not just ourselves, but to caretake this damaged ecology.
Right, and this is where
take care of the Frankenstein.
Yeah, and this is where we have to recognize and introduce the notions of centralized planning and how even though, hey, I may be from an anarchist perspective,
me too,
like recognize the lack of necessity in a utopian vision of bureaucracy and management and these sort of structures, but that the utility and transformation is there, and that's what is part of this roadmap.
I think we both like to adult with our anarchy, which we understand the strategic importance of planning and using the state as a vessel for transformation towards communism, what we would consider stateless socialism, which is pure anarchy, and the idea of decentralized communities that aren't being planned from above.
No bosses.
Exactly, but computer software programs, collaboration and coordination with humans to the common good of the local communities. So I think what's interesting is it acknowledges that this socialism could lead long term to communism.
Yeah, and one of the tools for doing that would be management of large scale social programs, like moving towards reconstruction, national reconstruction projects to carbon capture and to build solar power and sustainable energy infrastructure and sources, but also to reconstruct the environment, but also the universal basic income as a way to manage our allotment in this transitional period of scarcity.
And there's a really fascinating scene where he lifts these news aspects that I've somehow missed for the last couple of years. Like he talks about LA using a software program for parking, right? Which by the surface sounds like, oh my God, you're jerking off markets. You're neoliberal.
It reacts to the
space is open.
The open spaces.
And what this UCLA economist or whatever, or specialist said that you actually need to pay for parking in order to reduce the pressures on those parking spaces and decrease congestion and environmental pollution. So by putting a price on it that's sensitive to just the weight of the car, you actually reduce the amount of traffic and congestion as well as pollution. Because the thing is, it's not based on the capitalist need for profit. It's not based on the need or the whims of the market. It's using the market to perform for the common good.
Right.
And that's an argument that I think anarchists and socialists don't want to make, which is that markets can perform public good if routed through those energies.
And that's what this idea of universal basic income is. It is an idea that only really fits in capitalism.
Yes,
right,
exactly.
But it's a path out of it. It's within capitalism as a road away from it.
I thought that was brilliant that he says it's a process of decommodification for labor.
Yes,
that it actually strips away labor's weakness and emboldens labor. So I don't have to take this shitty job. Because it doesn't pay well. So that will get automated, right? And then I'll move to a job that does have more meaning, but that will pay better wages.
Well, we have to imagine that this looks like what we can imagine in the very near future for us if we had the political mobilization around it, which is a universal basic income and universal single-payer healthcare. Imagine the mobility, then the additional lanes of freedom that would open up for all of us.
And this is where I break off from most ideological, dogmatic anarchists, is that through state action, through strategic use of the state to open the size of the cage, to make the cage of the state larger, we allow for people to move enough that they can squeeze out of the cage. So UBI, guaranteed universal health care, other aspects that guarantee the movement to start localized transformative communities.
I think these things, too, along with free tuition for higher education, are going to be essential in any sort of Marshall Plan or large-scale public works plan for renewable energy and ecological reconstruction. Is I have to be unshackled from the bullshit jobs, and we all have to be unshackled from the bullshit jobs and the debt that are keeping us locked in place right now.
We both have student debt, right, which creates barriers for us. And I think the other thing is that Jill Stein, of everyone, who's called cuckoo clown by the fucked up mass media, she said, like, we should do quantitative easing to basically lessen and diminish and basically get rid of student debt, which she said if we got rid of student debt, it would be the greatest stimulus project in America. Because it's $1.3 trillion that young people no longer have to pay for and therefore can use their money for other services. And so it's actually a yoke on them. And by getting rid of and waiving debt altogether, using quantitative easing, which we're already doing for banks, and working out well for them, that we can essentially, wipe off that debt and create a movement for people that they don't currently have.
Yeah.
And Noam Chomsky talks about this is the power of debt through FAFSA and others, is that you don't pay for the student loan payments, and most FAFSA especially subsidized, until you graduate. Well, what happens when you graduate? You move 3,000, 1,000 miles away from your friends, and you're not talking daily about your debt burden.
Like me.
I'm not at the same college that you went to, so we can't talk about what came in the mail.
Exactly. Or like me, you finish your graduate work and then you move 1,200 miles away and have to work as a janitor.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the idea that we no longer feel
$20,000 a year.
Yes, and we no longer feel the solidarity that we were supposed to feel.
Yeah. Because
the debt has been atomized from us. And I think knowing this, that the scarcity we're talking about this is something we're seeing already, scarcity of money, right? I mean, not just scarcity of ecology, but scarcity of money for millennials. So in many cases, we'll go back to this. This is very much a platform of something millennials are already experiencing.
Yeah. So then the next one, and
the best possible future.
The best possible future, he uses the term communism here, but is one of equality and abundance. And this calls to mind the term that more left folks are using these days of fully automated luxury communism.
And some memes on Facebook on that one. And you actually come up with a term that's more anarchy friendly, which is like fully automated cooperation.
Yeah, I like the first three. Fully automated luxury, awesome.
Yeah,
let's try to do that. Do we
need that term? Yeah, exactly. It's too poisoned.
That's okay. I mean, if it was not,
it's a label hang up.
Hey, if we could,
we're not opposed to the term communism, but because it's not been defined by Karl Marx, it's been defined by others. It gets poisoned by the ideologies of state authoritarianism.
I would prefer to say fully automated luxury anarchism, but that's even
more poison. That's even more poison than communism. Yeah. But the problem is people don't even know. There's not. It's just a term that's not even connected to political discourse. It just means that we're going to beat up some shit.
But Russell Brand says, communism just means sharing. So if we can just
exactly. And those become loose. We shouldn't hang up on the labels. But the notion is that fully automated luxury, cooperation, communism, whatever term you want to use, means that, to borrow Marx's phrase, classic, probably most famous phrase, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs, right?
Yeah, so no need to work if you don't want to.
You hunt in the day, you fish at night, you write a...
Maybe.
I don't remember the phrase.
About that.
Well, the idea that you write a paper and you get beer and that work is basically invisible in some sense.
Yeah. But hey, remember, we're not going to be here if we're hunting. If we're still.
Well, I'm borrowing the Marx phrase, the idea.
I know, but if we move towards veganism, that'll help us get towards this future.
Well, if we're at socialism and scarcity, it may not matter. There may not be enough humans to worry about animal consumption. So he starts off with the book, and this is, of course, the beginning book that we're talking about last, which is, of course, the reason why we want to think that focusing on utopian politics is important for the ending of the book, is Player Piano by Kurt Vonnegut. I remember reading that book as a freshman in college, and I felt like it was interesting because I bought it for a while, and then as I got older, I was like, well, why is Kurt Vonnegut celebrating work? He assumes because him and his brother was an atmospheric physicist or scientist. So
I never read it, but I guess I assume that's from...
Well, and Kurt Vonnegut had a science degree as well as English degree background.
I know, but I gather that he takes this...
Celebration of work,
that he's like, where is it? He takes this...
Work is a force that gives you meaning.
Yeah. Takes this notion that where are we going to get where are we going to have meaning in our lives if we don't have work?
I was like, well, you've heard of hobbies, right?
And so then he
sex.
So then he also references here another fiction where there's no need for work for humans in the Disney film WALL-E. But in WALL-E, it's just gluttony.
Yeah, and eating and consumption and pleasure.
Yeah.
So mindless pleasure, blobs.
Pleasure,
and which is
obesity.
Obviously a powerful reference point to the most possibly prophetic dystopian text, E.M. Forster's The Machine Stops. And I'll give you a link to that on our show notes, which really inspired the notion of WALL-E, where people are just physical blobs that don't have muscle, and they ignore the physical world, so they're kind of underground in their And it's kind of a reversal of Time Machine, where the utopia is underground because they're afraid to see the physical earth above. And Wall-E plays on that conception. I mean, the idea of this is the way in which we often view, post-capitalist society with abundance, but we just lead ourselves to either distraction or misery because we can't figure out what to do with our free time.
But also, like, the protagonist is one of the robot happens to be the one that's the proletariat member who's struggling, and so we identify with that struggle, and so it's told from that perspective as opposed to
duty-bound proletariat worker,
and it's told from that perspective as opposed to the perspective of the luxury, the human experiencing the automated luxury.
Also, the notion of love, right? That
love is bound up with struggle.
Yeah, bound up with struggle. That they both. The humans and Wall-E lack real meaning, and that meaning comes from affection and love.
Yeah. I think one of the most important parts of this chapter and this discussion here is about work and why he introduced this discussion with the reference to Player Piano by Kurt Vonnegut is that this idea of like what value do we have if we don't have work, and pulls in the Marxist perspective here, which is that we have to get past this idea that work is a necessity, that we have to begin to see that work is a necessity that we can and must transcend if we're truly going to be free. Freedom starts where work ends.
When work no longer has any pejorative, or we don't even use it in the way that we use it now.
And we see it, this is our everyday, like when are we free? We're free when we leave the workplace.
On the weekends. In his discussion, we'll link the YouTube article.
We're both full-time
Well, he makes the distinction
slaves.
about, like, don't get hung up on the notion of work. He says this in the YouTube interview and presentation on the book for Verso and Jacob, and I'll link that on the show notes, is that we get hung up on the semantics of what is work. But really, the definition is, are you doing it from your free choice, or are you being coerced?
Right.
And so coercion is the question of whether it's work or bad work, right?
And it's not that work isn't a place where meaning exists. Like, I agree entirely. We experience glimpses of it, even if we are.
Our hobbies can be work that's pleasurable.
Yeah, the most fortunate individuals in the world today are those who actually are able to find, are lucky enough to have
meaning
a circumstance
after work and income.
Yeah.
So for me, I'm an example of this. As a college teacher, I have great. We say when we talk about happiness, mastery and autonomy are two components that drive people. And in my workplace, as a college teacher at UC Riverside, I get to design my own syllabi. I get to come up with my own course material. I pick my own books. I have mastery and autonomy. Right. And so, the grading feels like work, but the actual instruction and meeting students is incredibly meaningful.
So this is a future where we all can do what we love. And that actually will be meaningful.
And any shit that's bad or boring gets automated.
Right. And that actually can be a real possibility and a real choice that folks can make, as opposed to now it's just a myth that's used to further spin up the capitalist culture as referenced in Miya Takamitsu's book, Do What You Love, and other myths about success and happiness. This is a future where that's actually a possibility for us.
And it's important to recognize that 3 of these 4 involve some level of UBI. So this tells you that he's saying, like, UBI, we see it in the news, in books. There's like probably 14 books published in the last 5 years, and it keeps popping up. Hawaii just voted. I had read, but I hadn't followed the article about UBI being experimented with.
They're starting to talk
Germany's
about
doing it
legislation
in Cologne.
for UBI.
So this is going to happen in 3 of the 4 possible futures. And so that tells you that of anything, the assumption is that UBI is going to happen.
Yeah.
Maybe not in the short term. Remember, he talks about people from the left and the right that critique the idea that technological advancement is actually occurring because of productivity and because of people actually working, and also that low-wage labor is still existing. But when price points get to the point, they happen. I have a friend that both studied physics and also did engineering, and is developing robots to pick grapes, because the wages and the shortages of labor in California is forcing automation for picking grapes for wineries. And so I would say that the main thing to take from this is that of the 3 and 4, UBI is coming down the pipeline. And so there's a left version and a right version. The left version is that it's ameliorative and it's added to the existing welfare state, whereas the right is just going to replace all of the state. And so you take this and then walk away.
We'll talk a lot more about this when we'll do conversations specifically on UBI. But Yeah, there's a way in which UBI is a platform in which you can stand and gain more freedom. There's other way in which it can be implemented as a ceiling. So
take Peter Frase's comments on this truly, which is it's 70%, 75% likely, and the left better start thinking about it. We have to come ahead of this. We don't want to be like having von Hayek 10 miles ahead of us.
Yeah. So there's one last point here that I really liked and ties back to our previous discussions of the poison pyramid, and also some of the ideas or some of the potential ideas that were in that we talked about related to the circle, which was the remaining danger of hierarchy taking bloom and infecting this kind of utopian condition is one that's not tied to money, but is tied to status,
celebrity. Right? So he talks about Cory Doctorow's, Down and Out in the Magic Kingdom, which is hysterical now because it was written in 2003, but it's taking place in Disney World and obviously in Florida, which by 2030 half of it will be underwater anyways.
Could be.
But it imagines the idea of a post-scarcity society where everything runs on its reputation, what's called woofie points or woofies.
Yeah.
And your status among friends of friends ranks you and gives you kind of money through status.
Yeah.
And there's an article we'll link, we don't have time to talk about it, but where Cory Doctorow looks back from, the years past, like basically 2016, and says, well, this would be a horrible economic system.
It'd be worse.
It'd be worse. So he talks about, how we could reimagine society not using that. And also his discussions about that, as, Peter Frase mentions his friend Corey Robin, who says that communism isn't about getting rid of unhappiness. It's getting rid of hysterical misery.
Yeah. And I like this, how he inserted or how he framed this in here, because I just read this week, and wasn't even aware of this before we had this discussion about celebrity and the poison pyramid. We were saying how, or at least I was trying to argue that, look, if we got rid of capitalism and religion and the other forms of
the master hierarchy
the master hierarchies, and therefore potentially even the other attached forms of illegitimate hierarchies, we would still have a potential form of hierarchy that would ruin the world. And so he says, so ending capitalism and even ending patriarchy and racism won't end the possibility for conflict. So as long as we have some, whether it's fame or status or woofie.
He rejoinders by saying, well, look, it's easier to deal with those when you've got the biggest fucking magnet out of the room.
Yes.
Right? Its magnetic field corrupts and corrodes our understanding of those elements because it blocks out our vision.
Yes.
And so once again, I would highly recommend this book. This is a fantastic, brilliant little book.
I don't know if this is odd, this podcast that, hey, we're talking about this book, but the author's not here. Every other podcast I listen to has the author on it.
Well, we don't have the woofie points.
We don't have the woofie points. What the fuck?
We have no reputation.
Hey, we're not fucking famous. So
we have to pause when we do our podcast because of ambulances outside the window. We don't even have a studio. Our privilege is on the outer rim of privilege.
So we see this thing working right here in the dynamics of us trying to do this project. Like, we're putting this out there.
Help us get the woofie points. Put a review on, right? I mean, on Beleaguered iTunes.
But to take us out, I want to play a clip that's referenced in the book about communism, and he talks about Star Trek a lot here, and one of the things, the replicators, part of what makes possible
endless
this
energy
communist future. But let's listen to Jean-Luc Picard.
The economics of the future is somewhat different. You see, money doesn't exist in the 24th century.
No money? You mean you don't get paid?
The acquisition of wealth is no longer the driving force in our lives. We work to better ourselves and the rest of humanity.
Wow. Fuck me with Star Trek planes and ships and all that shiny Velcro. So that's communism there.
That's communism.
Picard.
Star Trek is communism.
You can't get your hair back in the future, but...
but you can have Earl Grey tea whenever you want it.
Data's makeup's falling off.
Just tell the replicator.
The android's makeup kind of melts from the movie, but or a TV
Hey,
show.
he doesn't have to worry about money.
Yeah, can't solve baldness.
So we hope, Peter Frase, if you hear this, would love to have you on for discussion.
Oh, please.
Maybe we get enough Wuffy points.
The sound of music.
At some point for it to be worth that transactional exchange.
We give you Wuffy points. We give you Wuffy points.
We just don't have
this book didn't get the attention it deserved.
Yeah,
three reviews, YouTube article. YouTube
we only have a very small audience right now, but we want to pass on some Wuffy points because it's a very great text. Bravo. We highly recommend it. We'll come back to these ideas in upcoming episodes. Until then, find us online at thefutureisamixtape.com. Send some messages to Matt and get into debates on Facebook at facebook.com/thefutureisamixtape.
Join our newsletter on thefutureisamixtape.com. And also, you'll want to think about, sharing the news that we're here and we exist with others.
Yeah, if you've listened, this will be episode 5?
Episode 5, yeah. I mean, the other thing we want to mention too is that you can leave on our website, thefutureisamixtape.com, audio recording of yourself telling us what you want the future to be.
We'll include it in the wrap-up of an episode. So do that. You can also find us on Twitter at Future Mixtapes. And yeah, if you've listened this far, all 5 episodes, there's probably something that was intriguing enough to keep you here. So tell some other folks about it. Maybe one day we'll have enough Woofy points to get one of these authors.
Well, yeah, so we can have our brain upload on a computer and our body reprogrammed every time someone tries to kill us.
Yeah, so thanks for listening.
Thanks, cheers.
We'll talk to you next week.